Hi, I'm Rachel Brezel, a licensed mental health counselor, and one of my specialties is OCD, and I'm here today on OK Clarity's Instagram to continue speaking about OCD. Okay, so for those of you that listened to part one, in part one, we generally spoke about what is OCD, the obsessions and the compulsions, to get a general idea of what OCD is. And then we also went into thoughts. So when someone was struggling with a thought, they didn't know, is it an OCD thought or just a regular uncomfortable thought? So that was part one. Today, we're going to go a little more deeply, and we're going to begin with my explaining a few subtypes of OCD. There are several, and they overlap tremendously, both in the obsessive part and the compulsive part. And they sometimes are grouped together. But for clarity purposes, I decided to try very hard to tease them apart and separate them so the audience could understand them better. So today, I'm going to be discussing checking OCD, harm OCD, symmetry OCD, just right OCD, and relationship OCD. I'm hopeful that next time I will go into contamination OCD, obsessions without visual compulsions OCD, which is known as pure O, hoarding OCD, magical thinking OCD, and scrupulosity/religious OCD. Those 10 subtypes is not an exhaustive list. They could be grouped differently, and it's not important to label them. The reason I'm sharing all of them is that there should be a clear understanding of what is OCD. Many of us walk into therapy saying, do I have OCD? I don't wash my hands. I don't care about things that are contaminated, so I don't have OCD. And actually, there are so many different types of OCD. Contamination is just one of many. So for clarity purposes, it's best to understand what is OCD, and to understand different ways that OCD can show up for ourselves or for loved ones so that we can get the help that we need. But otherwise, the labels are really not important. Okay. Another nice thing is that OCD, no matter if you have one or multiple different subtypes of OCD, they're all treated with the same protocol. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, ERP, exposure response prevention, and sometimes medication if necessary. And therefore, even if you have several subtypes, it doesn't mean, oh my goodness, I need to go to therapy for each subtype. And that's not true, because once you learn the right skill set, it works for all different OCD subtypes. Okay, so let's now start with the first one that we're going to be discussing and there's no particular order over here why I chose these 5 today and the other 5 for next time for part 3. So let's just jump right in. Okay, checking OCD. So with checking OCD, the obsession is mostly surrounds doubts and fears. The doubts and fears around danger or mistakes that we made. And it shows up very often as checking locks, checking, to make sure your doors are locked, to check that the sinks, the water is closed, that the fires are out, that appliances are off, that they're not plugged in. And that's how checking OCD is mostly categorized. Very, very similar to checking OCD is the second one that we're looking at, okay? And that is harm OCD. Now, with harm OCD, the obsession is about thoughts about harming oneself or others. And the compulsion is, again, a lot of reassurance seeking, and very often avoidances or getting rid of certain objects like knives or medication, or want to be left alone at home with a child, or even ourselves, fear of harming oneself. And that is the intrusive thought is harming oneself or others. Very similar to the checking OCD, which can also be a fear of harm. Again, not important to know these tiny details as far as is it checking OCD, is it harm OCD, just to get a general sense of the different types of OCD. Okay, let's go on to the next one that I mentioned, which is symmetry OCD. And like the word says, symmetry, you want things to be symmetrical in a certain order. And the obsession is, I need to have it in this order. I need it to be exactly like this. So what you would see the compulsion would be arranging the shirts, the chairs, the table setting, just that everything is very symmetrical and in the perfect order that you feel comfortable with. So that would be symmetrical OCD, symmetry OCD, which is extremely similar to the next one that we're going into, which is just right OCD. Okay, so we're symmetrical OCD focused on this feeling of I need balance and evenness, and they were very uncomfortable with the imbalance and unevenness. The just right OCD, which is very similar, it's an intense discomfort, internal, that things need to feel just right. The person is obsessing about this just rightness, completeness feeling. And the compulsion would be rituals or behaviors that are repeated to make the person feel just right internally. So it could be counting, it could be tapping or touching surfaces or objects in order to get that just right, complete feeling internally. Very similar to symmetry OCD. Okay, and the last one that we're going to speak about today, the last subtype, is relationship OCD. So with relationship OCD, the obsession is around the feeling of, am I in a good relationship, whether it's a romantic relationship or any other interpersonal, intimate relationship. Is this the right relationship for me? Is my spouse right for me? The conversation or the experience I just had with this other person, was there hidden meaning in what was said? Or constantly ruminating about what was said? Or, you're questioning the future with this person. You're questioning whether there's the right amount of love and intimacy in your relationship. And there's constant questions about this other person in your life. And you're seeking reassurance, or you're doing checking behaviors to check if this person is right, or you're comparing them to other relationships you had, or you're comparing it to what you perceive other people have with their spouse. So there's a lot of checking behaviors there around your relationship. Okay, I hope that was clear. I tried to make it succinct. Of course, it's much more detailed than that. Okay, so now I'm going to go into a question that came in. I'm going to read it, and I did change around some words to, make sure that it doesn't give out, I don't share any information that could lead to understanding who this person is. Okay. My son got married recently. He called me up a few days ago, very miserable. He's regretting marrying his wife because she is short and he is tall. It's become an obsession. He doesn't see anything else. She's a lovely girl, and he was so happy to marry her. As a teenager, he was obsessed with his nose and his freckles. I think that he has OCD. I feel so sorry for him. He's really suffering. And for my daughter-in-law, she has no idea why he's suddenly become so distant. Okay, first of all, my heart goes out to you, Mom. This is really hard. You just went through making a whole beautiful wedding for your son. And now he's suffering with these doubts in his mind. And the first thing I want to tell you is that I hear your pain, but this is very common and to be expected, in fact, because your son just went through a huge life transition. He got married, and that brings along with it much anxiety. And when anxiety is triggered, so is any other issues that the person has, whether it's OCD or anything else that they're struggling with. When we go through life transitions, it brings up a lot of anxiety, and then other things get triggered as well. So first of all, let's normalize this and see how we can best deal with it. So now I want to go into what you mentioned about your son before we discuss his relationship with his wife. So you mentioned that as a teenager, he was obsessed with his nose and his freckles. From the way you wrote this, it sounds like he never dealt with that. He just managed through it. The question I have is, was that the only obsession that he had with his nose and freckles? Just with his appearance or what he saw as flaws? Because I'm assuming that the nose and the freckles were things he didn't like about his looks. It could be that he did, but it sounded to me from the way you wrote it is that he didn't like his nose and his freckles, and he found it a defect and something that he wasn't comfortable with. So if that was the only obsession that he had, then it points a little bit more towards what we call body dysmorphic disorder, which is not OCD. They're very, very related, but they are not the same. So if it was body dysmorphic disorder, it means that the person is obsessed with what they perceive as a defect or a flaw in their appearance. If there were other obsessions, then that could mean that he has OCD or body dysmorphic disorder as well as OCD. Okay, now let's go back to your question about what should we do now with his obsession with his wife's height. So, again, this could be OCD. It could be what we just discussed, relationship OCD, or even checking OCD. Or it could be something we're going to be discussing in part 3, which is pure O, which is obsessions without visible compulsions. Or it could be very similar to body dysmorphic disorder, but whereas body dysmorphic disorder is about one's own flaws, there's something that's much less common called reverse body dysmorphic disorder, and that's the same as body dysmorphic, but it's on another person, and it's about very often a specific person and a specific flaw. In this case, it would be about his spouse and about her height. Again, what I would encourage you to do is validate your son's feelings, but don't give him reassurance that it's nothing, because then he's not going to deal with it. And here he has an opportunity that if he didn't deal with his freckles and his nose previously, here he has a fabulous, wonderful opportunity, a second chance, so to speak, to go to a professional that is a specialist in OCD and BDD, body dysmorphic disorder, and figure out what his struggle really is and get the life that he so deserves and a beautiful marriage, because it's probably either reverse body dysmorphic disorder or some subtype of OCD, and it's dealt with very similarly with CBT, cognitive behavior, or therapy, or as well as ERP, exposure response prevention, and sometimes some medication is indicated. But again, it definitely could be dealt with, and here is his opportunity, and I hope you encourage him to go and seek professional help. Best of luck for that. Okay, let's go on to the next question now. I have OCD. Kudos to you. You already know that you have OCD. Okay, I check if the doors are locked. I check the sinks. etc. And this just makes me more depressed. My mind is telling me how sick I am, or that I am guilty for having these obsessions and compulsions, especially as it went away for a while and then it came back. Now, what should I do? I'm at my wit's end. Well, knowledge is power. You know you have had OCD, and here it is rearing its ugly head again. And that makes sense, because the nature of OCD is it waxes and wanes. And like I mentioned earlier, very often a trigger will make it appear again. Some anxiety trigger, some transition in life, some big decision a person has to make. So maybe you can check with yourself and see what happened recently that made my OCD flare up again. All that said, that's what OCD does. It doesn't really ever totally go away. And that's okay. Because once we learn the skill set, how to deal with OCD, it's no big deal. It's just a little bump on our journey of life. And we use the same skill set that we learn in therapy to deal with it. And because I just mentioned all these subtypes, I'm sure you realize now that most likely your subtype of OCD is checking OCD. Certainly from the way you describe it, you're checking that the doors are locked, you're checking that the sinks are closed, etc., etc. So what I would encourage you is to go and meet with a therapist that specializes in OCD and mention this to that specialist, and they will set you up with a whole beautiful protocol of CBT, ERP, build you a hierarchy on how to deal with your OCD. And then the next time it comes, you will not say, oh my goodness, and have all this guilt or depressed feeling, but rather you'll say, hey, I got this. I'm so happy you're back. No big deal. Okay, so I hope that helps. And for any of you that have questions, I will be doing a part 3. Feel free to message me on my personal OK Clarity website. I will not answer directly to your question, but I will make every effort to address it in the next live I do for OK Clarity OCD part 3. Have a wonderful day and a great week. Thank you for listening.